Hi everyone, I'm Mike Todd and welcome to Toddy Tackles. This week I've been asked by a couple of friends to cover wood turning. They're looking to start the hobby and they've asked me to go through the basics about buying a lathe, the different tools and accessories you might need, and how to get started in the hobby. So this is my lathe. It's a Union Graduate. It's an old lathe but rock solid, cast iron, very heavy. And that's the first thing to think about, I think, with a lathe. Try and get a lathe that's heavy. The reason being is when you start turning pieces of wood that aren't symmetrical, it'll start trying to vibrate. And the heavier the lathe, the less that vibration will be, and it will soak up a lot of the movement. So weight on a lathe is really quite useful. And as you can see, this one is a very heavy cast iron lathe. The next thing to think about is what type of wood turning you want to do. There are two types primarily: turning between centres, where you turn pieces of wood with the grain running parallel to the lathe bed, and that's sort of things like spindles for stairs, rolling pins, snooker cues, those sorts of things. The other type of turning is faceplate turning, where you're turning typically bowls, and that requires a deeper lathe there, depending on the size of the bowl you want to turn. So that's the first thing to consider, is what type of turning you want to do. Now you can get a general lathe, which is what this is, will do both. And to give you an idea, the sizing of this lathe is 6 inches from the centre point to the bed. So on that I can turn a 12-inch bowl, and they call it a 40-inch bed, but it doesn't mean you can turn 40 inches between centres, because you've got the width of the tailstock. So on a 40-inch bed, this will turn comfortably 28, 29 inches. So I can turn 29 to 30 inches between centres and a 12-inch bowl. This actually has the benefit of an outboard setting, and this gives me the ability to turn a 10 inches drop on the end, so I can actually turn a 20-inch bowl. Now I've never turned a 20-inch bowl, and you've got to decide really early on, if you can, what type of wood turning you want to do. The next thing to think about is what type of fixings. Now this one comes with, well, it doesn't come with, this one's got centres that drive the wood, and these are like two prong or 4-prong centres. Now this is a 3 Morse taper, which means that's got a taper in there, and by friction fit that will hold that and drive that point. You can buy any accessory with a Morse taper fitting, so try not to go with ones where the manufacturers produce their own custom fitting, because it means you can only stick to their accessories. So ideally Morse tapers. So this one has got 3 in the headstock, and in the tailstock it's also a Morse taper, and you can see here I've got a live Morse taper fitting for the tailstock. Also look for a tool rest that moves easily on the lathe bed. One of my first lathes had special dials to turn and move this along, which meant you have to use tools to release it, to move it. And during turn you'll be moving this a lot, so you really want a nice quick release lever, enables you to slide it along nice and easily. A little tip is, if you use machine wax, this comes from a company called Axminster. It's just like it's almost like a polishing wax, but if you put that on the lathe bed, it will help these move along nice and easily. Similarly with the tailstock, you want to be able to bring this up nice and easily and without any use of tools. As soon as you've got to have tools to move these things, it becomes a bit of a faff, and it just disrupts the flow when you're working. So a lot of the work you'll be turning between centres with a simple drive dog, and you may want to do bowl work which you mount on a faceplate. Most lathes come with a faceplate, and there's no work you can't do on a faceplate. That said, if you end up with something like a screw chuck, you can screw that onto the headstock, and then you can mount different types of bowls and accessories on that a lot easier. And I used to work on the faceplate, but then I moved to a scroll chuck, and it just makes your life a lot simpler. You can buy all sorts of accessories. There are rings that you screw to the bottom of the bowl, or you can screw it straight to the bowl. There's things like pepper mill holders and all sorts of accessories that go onto that chuck. And I think sooner or later you'll probably want to buy one. Another nice feature in this case is multiple speed. This has got 4 speeds ranging from 425 revs to 2250 revs. I usually set it at 790 revs, and I found that that's a nice comfortable speed for most work. If you're turning, when you start initially turning big bowl blanks, you need to reduce the speed to stop the vibration, and then you can increase the speed, which gives you a better finish. This is belt driven, which makes it a little bit of a mess or a bit more complicated to change the speeds. If you've got a variable speed on the dial, it's a real nice feature. So if you can get variable speed, I would go for that. So that's really it. To choose a lathe, try and go for a well-known manufacturer if you can. Get one that's nice and heavy, because that will soak up the vibration when you're turning irregular shapes. Have slides and rests that move nice and easily, both up and down and along. Similarly with the tailstock, ideally go for Morse tapers rather than manufacturer specific threads or gauges, because then you can buy accessories from other suppliers rather than just from the manufacturer, and that'll give you a far wider range of accessories. Think about the length and the diameter of the type of work you want to turn. Outboard feature's nice. As I say, I've had this 15-20 years. I've spent hundreds of hours turning. I've never turned anything on the outboard. I've got the chucks and the facilities to do so, but that's a real nice to have. But if it's an additional cost, I wouldn't really bother with that. So really, if you can get a 6-inch drop by a 30-inch between centres, that's going to cover very much 90% of all the work you're going to need. Now, you don't need many tools to get started. First of all, safety glasses, as you'd expect. I would recommend one of these turning smocks. They zip right up and it stops all of the dust and chippings going down your collar, which is a real irritant. They've also got these Velcro cuffs, so they tighten up. There's no loose clothing to get caught in the lathe. So I would definitely recommend a turning smock. In terms of chisels, there are hundreds. You don't need to buy that many. I would recommend 3 gouges and maybe 2 or 3 other tools. The first, we'll look at the gouges. So that's a roughing out gouge. As you can see, it's quite a big gouge. Nice long handle that I made. In fact, that's a bit of copper pipe, and one of the turning jobs you can do is turn your own tool handles for the lathe. Nice big handle, which means I've got plenty of leverage. I'll stand. I can get it into my hand, into my stomach, and it means that I've got nice control over the chisel. So the first one I would get is a roughing out gouge. It enables you to take, when you're turning between centres, take the edges off the wood very quickly, so you can drop a bit of wood down to a nice round blank with a roughing out gouge. The next one would be a spindle gouge, which, as you can see, you compare the two, same principles, a rounded chisel, but the roughing out gouge is a lot deeper and the spindle gouge is a lot shallower. And what the spindle gouge does, again, nice long handle, so you get good control over it. And the spindle gouge will get these types of flutes in between centres, so it enables you to do nice sweeping curves between centres. Lots of other uses for it, but the spindle gouge is a useful tool to have. If you're doing lots of bowls, then you get a specific bowl turning gouge. It's a really heavy blank, very thick stock, because when you get into bowls, there's a lot of leverage on that edge, and you'll find that you need a long, strong handle with a thick blank to the gouge. These are ground. I ground these to what's called a fingernail grind. You'll find the one that suits you best. There's loads of recommendations with all the tools. I would suggest start off with the recommendations in terms of grinding, and we'll cover how to sharpen them later on, and then adjust them to the way you feel most comfortable, because wood turning, you need to be comfortable with the method that you've adopted, and somebody else's style of grinding might not suit your wood turning. So start off with the recommended angles and then adjust them as you need to. So they're the three gouges. You've got a rough turning gouge, spindle gouge and a bowl gouge. A couple more chisels that are useful when you start out. A skew chisel, which as you can see is like an offset chisel, ground on both edges, and you use this for V work into the spindle, so you can cut lines into the wood and then create V's. You can also turn it round and turn beads with it, so really useful tool called a skew chisel. And lastly, really, you need a parting chisel. So if you've finished your work and you want to part it off, this will cut through the wood and separate it, and that's called a parting tool. This was my dad's. I've used it for years, but I actually made my own, which is fairly agricultural, but it does the job. It's an old hacksaw blade that I've ground down. The reason I like this one, it's very thin, so it means that you don't get a lot of friction, and you also don't get a lot of wastage, so you can come in really close to the work, and that enables you to part off. Realistically, you don't need those. You can actually just use a saw, turn the lathe off and just saw it off by hand with a handsaw. So the last two tools are nice to haves, but the things you definitely need are gouges and skew chisels. Now there are lots of other chisels you can get. I've just made this one actually, so I made the handle again, and this has got a tungsten carbide tip. So all I did was, a bit rusty. All I did was drill and tap a piece of steel and mount that in a handle. That's good for bowls, and it means that you don't have to sharpen them, you just put new tips in. Scrapers, they're ground differently to chisels, and as their name suggests, they sit flat on the rest and they scrape the wood off. Used properly, they're very good. I don't really like them personally. They come in all shapes and sizes. There's another different type of scraper. You can also, if you're engineeringly minded, make your own chisels. It's a bit of silver steel I just ground out on the milling machine, so I ground a flute in it, and that was for a particular job, so it's like a small bowl gouge. One word of warning: don't ever use wood carving chisels. I found out fairly early on that if you use a wood carving chisel, you'll snap them, and they're just not designed to take that level of strain across the blade, so you'll snap the blade clean off. Because I thought I had a little turning job, put a little wood carving chisel in there would be ideal, and I broke it. So you can buy a set of chisels now where you get 4 or 5 chisels, you get gouges, skew chisels and parting tools. This actually is from a set of tools by Ashley Isles, I believe. Oh no, sorry, Henry Taylor. So Henry Taylor makes sets of chisels. I actually bought this one, I think, it was just as an individual, but you can buy these in a set. And it's a good way of starting out, because you get 4 or 5 key chisels in a set and you will use them all. You might end up buying additional ones, adding to them, or you may end up just using those and becoming proficient in those. So it doesn't matter, whatever tool does the job that you're trying to get is the right tool for the job. So it's a good way of starting off. Buy a set of chisels, and then you know you've got a good set of solid chisels. I would say get good quality tools. Some of the overseas tools that we get, the steel is not very good quality, doesn't hold its edge very long, and you spend more time sharpening them than you do wood turning. So I'd recommend getting good quality tools, keep them sharp, which we'll cover later on, and you won't go far wrong. Other things you might want to consider, things like a chuck for the towel stock if you want to drill holes into the end grain. So this would enable us to drill a hole through the wood. This is just a standard Jacob's chuck on a Morse taper, and I'm forcing a bit into that, so we're actually making a pepper mill at the moment. So that's a useful tool to have in a towel stock. But again, you don't need that. You can actually do it by hand with a chisel. A bit more awkward, but tools are good, they're quite handy accessories to have. Again, because it's got a Morse taper, I can buy any Jacob's chuck, so I don't need to stick to the manufacturer's one. Other things that are useful, accessories, different types of tool rest. As you can see here, this is a nice long tool rest. So when you're turning between centres, that tool rest will go part way, virtually the whole length of the tool of the work. So it means I haven't got to keep adjusting it. Whereas if I had a smaller tool rest, I can do that bit, then I move along, move along, move along, and you end up getting ridges where you've joined up. So different size tool rests are always handy. And you can also get what are called bowl rests. So this fits in, and that will go inside the bowl. And you can put things like I mentioned, the scrapers. The scraper will sit flat on that, and it means it gives a good platform and reduces vibration. Again, realistically, I use that for 99% of my work. That's a nice backup. And the bowl rest I use less frequently. You can also get all sorts of fittings for this bowl rest. So you get an S rest, so you can go around the outside of bowls and the inside of bowls with that. A straight rest. So there's all sorts of different rests you can buy. So hopefully you've got enough information to think about your first lathe. Just to recap, the key things to consider are what type of work you want to do. Do you want a lot of distance between centres for long work, or a large drop for bigger bowls? Try and get a lathe that's got plenty of weight in the body, so it reduces the vibration. Try and get standard fittings so you can pick accessories from other manufacturers. Variable speed is a prerequisite really, and because as you start turning the big components, you need them on a slow speed, and then as they get more concentric, you can increase the speed and get a finer finish. Ideally, a variable speed dial makes life a lot easier. Lastly, get a strong motor. This has got a 1.5 horsepower motor. It means it can drive heavy work without labouring. What you don't want to do is, while you're turning, the friction of the tool and the weight of the piece means that the lathe stops. You want it to keep powering through when you're taking heavy cuts. So that's it. Hopefully you found that useful. I think I've covered the main basics. There are lots of other things, and I would research all of the machines before you make your purchase. Ideally, try them out. A lot of the suppliers, you can actually go down and see them working, look on YouTube and see the reviews. So it's an expensive product, and you really want to buy once and buy wisely. So hopefully I've helped you out with some of the things you need to think about. Most expensive is not always the best. There's some really good lathes out there. This one, for example, cost me £400. Now, all right, that's a lot of money, but I've had it, as I say, nearly 20 years, and I've done a lot of work on it, and it's never let me down. So new is not always best. Some of the older models are very good. I really hope you found this video useful. Please add any comments or subscribe below. Remember, always wear your safety glasses in the workshop and look out for future videos of Toddy tackles.